Okay. Thank you. My name is Frank Sysyn. I'm the director of the Peter Jacyk Center for Ukrainian Historical Research at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies of the University of Alberta. Today is a presentation of the major accomplishment of our Cossack Ukraine project, a project that has been supported for many years by the W.K. Lipinski East European Research Institute, for which we are very grateful. The major participants of these projects have been Larissa Bielaus and above all Zenon Kohut and his work on a monograph on the making of Cossack Ukraine. Before we begin our presentation, I'd like to ask Dr. Natalia Konenko-Friesen, director of our institute, to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Frank. As a director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, it really gives me great pleasure to welcome all to this very important book discussion focusing on Zenon's most recent book, The Making of Cossack Ukraine, Political Thought, Culture and Identity Formation, 1659-1714. Zenon Kohut has continually played and continues to do so an important role in academic life of our university, of our institute, and especially so in the area of his own expertise. And I couldn't miss an opportunity to welcome all to this very important discussion in a kind of celebration of academic achievements of my predecessor in such gathering as today. I am happy to pass on back the torch to Frank Sysyn to navigate us all through this wonderful, wonderful academic event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Today we will be celebrating the commissioning of Zenon's book, The Making of Cossack Ukraine, to the press. It will be forthcoming in the next upcoming academic year. We are grateful to the Canadian Foundation for Ukrainian Studies and the Peterson Literary Fund at the BCU Foundation for their support of this monograph. Our order will be the following. Zenon has provided us with a PowerPoint presentation explaining many of the issues he addresses in this book. After that, we will have a discussion of those who have read the book and apply it to their field. Serhiy Ploki, the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, Nancy Shields Coleman, professor of history at Stanford University, but also in a certain way, one of the founders of Ukrainian studies from our early days as graduate students at Harvard, at the Ukrainian Institute at Harvard. And I will be the third presenter. We then would request you to please give questions online. And if conditions work out, we hope that Zenon will be able to deal with some of these questions, or they will be part of our discussion and our commentary. So first, I would like to ask Larissa Bielaus to please play for us the PowerPoint presentation.
I am delighted to be able to present my latest book that took over a decade to research, write, and edit. During this time, I was also encountering serious health issues. The completion of this work has brought considerable joy to my life. However, before delving into the book, a few words about terminologies are in order. A major issue is the name Ukraine itself. In early modern times, various names including Rus, Russia, Little Russia, Belarus, Malorussia with two S's, and Ukraine, Ukraina, were applied to part or all of the Ukrainian lands. On occasion, Rus, Russia, and Little Russia were also used for the Ruthenian lands of the entire Commonwealth. These usages, with wider meanings, persisted in some circles. However, in the political sphere, forms of Ukraine and Little Russia became accepted designations, particularly for the polity of the Zaporozhian host. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the terms Rus underwent changes in meanings and spelling, but its use was retained in the civil affairs of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That is, Rus, Russia, Ruskie Kняжівство. Thus, for both Ruthenians and Poles, Rus meant the people and lands of Ukraine and Belarus, although by the early 17th century, this more often referred specifically to Ukraine. To the east existed Muscovy, Moskva, and its inhabitants were called Muscovites, Muskale. However, under the influence of revived Greek learning in ecclesiastical circles, Rus was gradually replaced by Russia. The Metropolitan of Kiev began calling himself Metropolitan of all Russia in the late 16th century. From texts of that time, it is clear that Russia then did not refer to Muscovy, but only to the Orthodox lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In the 17th century, the Hellenized version, Rusiane, displaced Rusene as a term for the people living in those lands, with Rusiski as the adjectival form. Thus, Rusiski Narod still designated the Ruthenian nation, meaning Ukrainians and perhaps Belarusians, but not Russians. The single exception was the use of Rusiski in reference to a monarch, regardless whether he was the ruler of medieval Rus or contemporary Muscovy. As terms equivalent to Russian Muscovite monarchs and glorious Russian realm gained greater usage, Russia came to be to apply also to territories and inhabitants of this Russian realm outside of the Ruthenian areas. In order to distinguish Ruthenian from non-Ruthenian Russia, I've coined the term Rutheno-Russia. Russia and its derivatives were found primarily in church writings and Baroque literature, in government documents, whether Tsarist or of the Hetmanates, forms of Little Russia, Great Russia, and Ukraine predominant. This book traces the evolution of early modern Ukrainian political thought and culture from its 16th century origins to 1714. It examines the various strands of political thought and cultures operating in Cossack Ukraine, whether of the Ruthenian nobility, the Kievan clergy, or the Cossacks, and how they were interrelated, with some elements passing from one strand to another and from one chronological period to another. Thus, the political culture and thought of Cossack Ukraine had many complex components that were in constant interplay and development. My interest is how these components contributed to the development of political, territorial, religious, ethnic, and national collective visions that reflected early modern concepts of nation, state, and identities. It is also important to explain my chosen time frame. Periodization had long shaped our understanding of the past, and the breaking down of period boundaries has been a fruitful way to rethink many historical questions. For Russian historians, the Petrine epoch has long been the dividing line between the pre-Petrine period and the post-Petrine imperial or modern period. For historians of Poland, the boundaries have often been the Union of Lublin, 1569, the Cossack Revolt of 1648, and the period of reforms of the late 18th century, and the partitions. This last divide also fits with the frequently held view of the French Revolution sparking the modern age. Thus, the period from 1500 to 1800 would be referred to as early modern, at least since the rise of early modern studies in the 1950s. The early modern period has been convenient for many who conceive Ukrainian history as having a middle period or Cossack age. This fits within the paradigm of Hrushevsky's 4 cycles of Ukrainian history: Old Rus, Polish-Lithuanian, and Cossack age, with the 3rd cycle seen as a period of rebirth. The 4th cycle, which Hrushevsky did not reach in his magnum opus, was the end of the Cossack age, with the abolition of Cossack autonomies. Later historians, such as Ivan Leshak-Rudnitsky, influenced by the statist school of Ukrainian historiography, tended to divide Ukrainian history by the Polish annexation of the central Ukrainian lands at Lublin. While my starting point fits many of the accounts of various aspects of Ukrainian history, my endpoints, the Bandera Constitution, and the creation of Orlik's grand narrative of Cossack autochthony, antiquity, legitimacy, and perpetual rights, does not. Here I would seem to be in a concord with historians of Russia, who describe this period as one of the great change in which Ukrainians played a substantial role, even though some historians of Russia have argued for considerable change in the 17th century that makes the Petrine period seem somewhat less revolutionary. The Petrine period still seems the basic caesura. In contrast, most Ukrainian historians see the 18th century as the cultural and intellectual flowering of the Cossack age. While I do not deny these continuities, I argue for political thought and culture as the fundamental building blocks and concept of Cossack Ukraine had emerged by the early 18th century, and therefore the focus of this book. In the post-Poltava structures, these building blocks and concepts were to be integrated and reconstituted in the left bank hetmanate, and they were to play a substantial role in the forming of the political culture of the Russian Empire. Yet they had already taken shape by the 2nd decade of the 18th century. Here, too, one must carefully consider periodization. The political culture of Cossack Ukraine continued in various forms after the abolition of the Cossack autonomies, and in many ways provided the foundations for the Ukrainian political and cultural formations of the 19th century Ukraine. In the epilogue, I will try to present some of the most salient features of these post-Poltava processes, based primarily on my previous research and observation. Such a summary serves to connect early modern Ukrainian political thought and culture from its 16th century origins to modern times and modern nation building and identities. This book focuses on what I consider the major components of early modern Ukrainian political thought and culture. Concepts of a Ruthenian Ukrainian Little Russian nation and people, the role of the Orthodox faith, a Ruthenian Ukrainian territorial and political entity, the privileges of the Cossack host, and visions of Ukraine Little Rus and of a Ukrainian Little Rus fatherland. Another persistent theme in Ukrainian political thought was that of the Ukrainian Little Rus nation as a free nation, never having been conquered and having submitted itself to its rulers voluntarily, with the recognition of its perpetual rights and liberties. At the same time, this study also deals with the concept emanating from the synopsis of 1674, 1678, and 1680-81 of Ukraine and Russia being part of a continuous Slavano-Russian tsardom stemming from Kievan Rus, thus justifying perpetual Tsarist rule. In my study of the political thought and culture of Cossack Ukraine, I have come to the conclusion that a new, though bifurcated culture took place at the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th century in what I've called the Mazepian synthesis and the Cossack grand narrative. The Mazepian synthesis represented a distinct stage in early modern state building. It envisioned a state of the Zaporozhian host and the Ruthenian people nation, but within the claimed territorial limits of the host. Officially, the state was still called the Zaporozhian host, and it encompassed the country labeled as Ukraine or Little Russia or Russia or Rutheno Russia. This country was considered the fatherland, toward which the populace was expected to show love, loyalty, and respect, and the hetman figured as the father of the fatherland. The Mazepian synthesis was an attempt to establish an ideological foundation for a Cossack Ruthenian state and an Orthodox Ruthenian Russian people nation within the framework of Tsarist and Muscovite rule. The first element in conceptualizing state and nation was fostering an image of the hetman as warrior ruler and defender of Ruthenia Russia and the Ruthenian Russian people against the infidel Turks and Tatars with the support and under the authority of the Muscovite Tsar. This represented the great common mission of the Cossack, the Ukrainian clergy, the Ruthenian Russian people, and the Muscovite authorities that united Ukraine and Muscovy. The second element of conceptualizing state and nation was connecting the Cossack state and the Ruthenian Russian people with ancient Rus and presenting the present-day Ruthenian Russia, the Ruthenian Russian Church, the hetman, the Zaporozhian host, and the Ruthenian Russian people nation as continuing the political, religious, and spiritual heritage of Rus. This gave the Cossack state and the Ruthenian Russian people a distinguished pedigree and heritage. The third element in conceptualizing state and nation was the appropriation by the hetman of the most sacrosanct spiritual visions of Rus Ruthenian Orthodox people. The main instruments in implementing such an effort included the renewal and maintenance of the main holy places of Rus, enhancing Orthodox sacred space by the construction of new churches, invigorating cults of Ruthenian saints, and adapting cults of patron saints and concepts of Kiev's spiritual significance, that is, New Jerusalem, New Israel, Saint Sophia, to contemporary conditions. With these endeavors, Mazepa attempted to position himself not only as the secular ruler of an invigorated Ruthenian Russia, but also as the leader of a sacred Russian Israel, a new Zion, and was the continuation and reflection of a heavenly Jerusalem, chosen and blessed by God, biblical figures, the apostles Andrew and the Ruthenian saints. By invoking these concepts and images, the secular and clerical elite not only shaped a specific political religious culture, but also created the ideological underpinnings for an integrated Mazepian polity. The consequences of Poltava forced Mazepa's successor, Philip Orlik, and the Ukrainian elite to reconsider and rearticulate their fundamental beliefs and values. The Bandera Constitution has to be considered the most significant achievement of the Orlik era. It envisioned a form of governance that can be referred to as a Republican Commonwealth and delineated Ukraine's territorial, political, religious, financial. However, one conceptual innovation had a more lasting effect: the Orlik grand narrative. It refuted or transformed the postulates of the Kievan synopsis by tracing Ukraine's origins not to a Slavonic Russian people ultimately linked to the Muscovite Tsar, but to a more ancient Cossack Khazar free nation. It postulated a Cossack nation that had a more ancient history than that of the Muscovites, that had different rulers, and that converted to Christianity earlier. Having nothing to do with ancestors of the Russian monarchs, the Khazar Cossacks were not obliged to obey them. The Orlik grand narrative also refuted the Mazepa synthesis. It argued for the independent origins of a free Cossack nation that was in no way linked to Muscovy or the Muscovite Tsar. The people and territory were considered as indigenous possessions, perpetual rights that were at times damaged and the integrity of which needed restoration. The Orlik era represents a turning point in the shaping of Ukrainian political thought. For the first time, the Cossacks delineated the foundations of Cossack Ukraine and established an ethnic, historical, and religious pedigree which differentiated fully the Cossack nation and Ruthenian people from Muscovy Russia. Thus, by 1714, there were two separate yet interrelated political narratives of Cossack Ukraine. The Kievan clerical concept of Slavano-Russia, represented by the synopsis, and the Cossack grand narrative of the Orlik Constitution. These narratives would play a significant role in the further evolution of the political culture of Cossack Ukraine. First and foremost, this work attempts to present the political thought and culture of Cossack Ukraine on its own terms, without tying it to any overreaching schemes or projects. However, it does tackle its implication of early modern political thought for the construction of modern nationhood and identities. In fact, I consider this political thought as one of the foundations for not only Ukrainian state and nation building, but also modern Russian identity and sense of nationhood. Since this book is concerned with early modern discourses of patriotism and national allegiance, it becomes embroiled in the long-standing conflict between the primordialists, who view nations as organic evolutions from primordial times, and the social constructivists, who adhere to the idea that nations were constructed in the 19th and 20th century. Thus, according to classical nationalism studies, one cannot talk about nations and nationalism in context of early modern societies, that they are relevant only for the historical realities from the late 18th and early 19th century. Modern Ukrainian historiography fits into the primordialist category. Similar to Western European historians, 19th and early 20th century Ukrainian historians were developing national histories. The national concept was promulgated by populist historians, culminated with Mikhailo Hrushevsky, In his pragmatic article, Hrushevsky called for separate treatment of the histories of three East Slavic nationalities as individual histories of different peoples, narody, and rejected the traditional Russian imperial state-focused approach. Hrushevsky postulated the continuity of Ukrainian history as the history of the Ukrainian people and identified a series of national revivals during its course. At the beginning of the 20th century, under the impact of the national movement and Ukraine's brief period of independence, the populist approach was modified for a new statist orientation. When the state school historians looked into the past, they saw periods when Ukraine was virtually an independent state. Nevertheless, both populist and statist Ukrainian historians adhere to the view of the organic evolution of the Ukrainian nation from Kievan Rus to contemporary times. They were promoters of national history. The history of Cossack Ukraine was developed within the populist and state paradigms. While having been muted during the Soviet era, Cossack history, and particularly its state and nation building role, experienced a flowering in post-Soviet Ukraine. These historians have rediscovered, partially recovered, in some instances reconstructed the history of an early modern Ukrainian political entity, the Hetmanate. They have successfully incorporated the previously prescribed scholarship of the state school and national populist historiography published in the Russian Empire, Ukraine, and Soviet Union into a renewed national narrative. The evolution of the Ukrainian national paradigm fitted within the general development of Western historiography. While most scholars believed the nation to be a phenomenon that arose after the French Revolution, a number of historians and political scientists, Hugh Seton Watson, Anthony Smith, John Armstrong, Klaus Zernak, Adrian Hastings, and Kaspar Hirschi, saw nations originated in or derived from medieval or early modern communities. Early modern specialists, in particular, have long pointed to elements of nationhood and national consciousness in the pre-modern era. One can find an extensive discussion of proto-national sentiments and loyalty to patria, fatherland, in the early modern rules by the eminent historian John Eliot. Although historians would differentiate these proto-national phenomena and identities from modern ones, they rarely provided a clear explanation of where the difference lay. Nevertheless, scholars who were dealing with early modern history began adapting the idea of nation and national identity to the pre-modern context and interpreted patriotic discourses as, in some sense, national ideologies. This book is part of this more recent scholarship on early modern patriotism, nationhood, and identity, but focused on Ukraine. It represents the culmination of 4 decades of my work on these topics. Thus, in this work, I build upon my previous studies on concepts of fatherland, routine in Ukrainian Little Russian nation, narod, Cossack liberties, and issues regarding Ukrainian-Russian relations, and provide a systematic and comprehensive synthesis. I also rely heavily on the robust development of scholarship in early modern Ukraine. In this introduction, I can mention only a few names that had particular impact on my thinking on the subject. The pioneering work of Teresa Czyzewska-Henel on national conscience among nobles and Cossacks in Ukraine in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and Natalia Kovenko's monograph on the Ukrainian nobility and her later writings on the thought and political culture of Ukraine formed the background of my views. These were honed further by my close association with two colleagues, Frank Sysyn and Serhiy Plokhy. In contrast to the early modernist, historians of modern Ukraine favored the paradigm of nations being 19th and 20th century constructions. Generally, they followed the theory of the Czech scholar Miroslav Hroch about three stages of national development of Eastern European peoples. The first stage was the passionate concern on the part of a group of individuals, usually of the intellectuals, of the language, the culture, the history of the oppressed nationality. According to Hroch, their concern was motivated by local patriotism of the Enlightenment type. Second, active patriotic agitation as the fermentation process of national consciousness. And the last stage, national consciousness, has become the concern of broad masses. There is no place in this scheme for Ukrainian identity formation in the early modern period, except as a prologue, when territories that constitute modern Ukraine were divided between different states, and although the people that populated those lands did not have a national consciousness due to the lack of modern mechanism for its emergence and development, they nevertheless formed an ethno-cultural community as a predecessor of a modern nation and a certain signs of early nation building. A number of historians question or reject entirely the paradigm of national history. Andriy Portnov, Tatiana Portnova, Serhiy Savchenko, and Victoria Serhienko indicate how at numerous times various elements of the Ukrainian national history narrative have been deconstructed and criticized by Ukrainian historians, so much so that this narrative no longer has validity. However, these partial revisions were always marginalized and rebuffed by the very fact that they did not fit the established, coherent, and all-embracing master narrative, but also did not offer an equally comprehensive alternative story. Grigory Kasyanov warned against the archaization of terms national and national consciousness. That is common among the historians who deal with early modern Ukrainian history of the 16th and 17th century. At the same time, Kasyanov recognized that preconditions for the formation of a certain form of consciousness existed in the 16th and 17th centuries, and later, much later, it began to be called national, and the formation of which took place in the following centuries. While I certainly agree with Kasyanov on the existence of a certain pre-modern proto-national consciousness, I do not accept the idea that this consciousness can only serve as some sort of depository from which 19th and 20th century historians can draw from while inventing the nation. To my mind, political thought and culture of Cossack Ukraine forms a distinct stage and foundation in the evolution of concepts of a Ukrainian state and nation. It is my conviction that all political thought and national identities are constructed, usually as the result of many-sided dialogues among competitors. As stated by Tomasz Konarski, collective identities are inherently dynamic, and unstable and can be infused with conflicting meanings and employed for disparate purposes. Finally, that the clear-cut opposition between inheritance, continuity, and rupture, invention of national identities is artificial, as cultural products are neither made from scratch nor ossified, but repeatedly reassembled from items at hand. I do not subscribe to the notion of a perennial people nation that evolves through time, exhibiting different forms of expression and culminating in the modern nation state. However, I do believe that various constructs operating in Cossack Ukraine, whether of the Ruthenian nobility, the Kievan clergy, or the Cossacks, were interrelated with some elements passing from one strand to another and from one chronological period to another. Other elements were dropped, some were reanimated in other time frames. Yet, as I demonstrate in this book, that this political culture had considerable cohesiveness and continuity. Moreover, it produced a historical narrative that made Ukrainian history distinct from Polish and Russian history. It defined a historical space that could not be readily assimilated into the histories of the region's dominant nations. Thus, it fulfilled the task of a national history. I do recognize the profound difference between early modern and modern views of Ukrainian identity and nationhood. In the first instance, they were the expression of an elite, nobles, Cossack officers, higher clergy, who were asserting their political, religious, and territorial rights, while in modern Ukrainian nation building, the national leaders were attempting to raise an ethnic community to a politically conscious nation. However, I do not believe that there was a complete rupture between the early modern and modern. As stated by Andreas Kapler, the pre-modern history of the ethnic groups that were a part of the multi-ethnic Russian Empire was also of significance in that it constitutes the prehistory of nations, which in the 19th and 20th century did not suddenly appear from nowhere. In my view, modern Ukrainian identity would not be possible without its pre-modern roots, and that Ukrainian political thought and culture were indeed repeatedly reassembled from the items at hand. Each reassembly represented a stage in the evolution of Ukrainian political thought and culture, and, in my mind, a stage in Ukrainian nation building. Thus, Hrushevsky reassembly contained not only a new emphasis on the Ukrainian masses, but also the idea of the Ruthenian nation of nobles. The Ruthenian Cossack idea was a rejection of the concept of a Slavano-Russian people, the adoption of historical periodization of Safonovich's Chronica, and the concept of Ukraine as a fatherland. In the ever-evolving construction and reconstruction of Ukrainian political thought, there were a myriad of concepts, projects, and identities. In addition to the envisioning of a Ruthenian Little Russian Ukrainian people nation, there was the short-lived notion of a Rus Cossack Ukraine within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Other concepts such as a Slavano-Russian people and of a little Russia within an all-Russian empire resonate even today. Thus, the construction of the political culture and thought of Cossack Ukraine should be viewed as a multi-layered process in both history and geography, with all its continuities, discontinuities, and contradictions. Nevertheless, this cauldron of construct was fundamental for the envisioning of modern Ukrainian identity and a sense of nationhood. Thus, the political thought and culture of Cossack Ukraine can be considered an aspect in Ukrainian and to some extent Russian state and nation building. Thank you for your attention, and I would especially like to thank Larissa Bilaus for assisting in putting together the PowerPoint.
Thank you. And we are grateful for your effort in giving us this summary and discussion of your book. I might add the book will be coming out next year as a joint publication of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies Press and McGill Queen's Press, and will be available for your perusal then. I also want to thank Zenon for having fulfilled one of the mandates of the Peter Jacyk Center for Ukrainian Historical Research. One of the hopes of its founder were that work on periods after those which Hrushevsky dealt with would be carried on. We have put out recently a volume of essays on 18th century Ukraine, a monograph by Serhiy Belenky on 19th century Ukraine, and Zenon's work on Cossack Ukraine, interestingly enough, crosses from the period that Hrushevsky dealt with to the period which he did not arrive at. We will not know what he would have written, but we fortunately have the Hrushevsky professor of Ukrainian history, Serhiy Plokhy, here to comment on how Zenon has treated that period in time.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you, Zenon. Thank you for this presentation. Thank you for writing this book. It's certainly a major milestone in the career of one scholar, but it's also a milestone in the development of Ukrainian historiography on such important part of Ukrainian history as the Hetmanate. Some of the biggest names made their contribution in Ukrainian history, made contributions specifically studying the history of the Cossackdom. And it is always a challenge to add something new that in terms of synthesis or in terms of any particular and specific research to the topic that has been started by people like Hrushevsky and Bogali and Lipinski and many, Kupikavich and others in the 19th and 20th century. I think that this book certainly makes a major contribution. It makes it on a number of levels, and I will talk about those levels. But first I want to say that when I was reading this volume, I was thinking about Zenon's first book on the Russian centralism and Ukrainian autonomy that covers or focuses rather on the period of after the Battle of Poltava, after the Constitution of Podlik. So it covers 18th and 19th century. And from that point of view, from that perspective, the chronology makes a lot of sense to me. It really establishes Zenon as author of the really quite classic, I would say, presentation of Ukrainian history from the beginning of the emergence of the Cossack as a separate social class with its own political thought, and up until the full integration of the Cossack institutions and Cossack intellectuals into the Russian Empire. So that I looked at that as a basically one of two volumes that establishes Zenon as really a paramount figure in the study of Cossackdom. Drawing comparison to the book that was researched and then published and researched in the 70s and in the 80s, published in the late 1980s, I want to say that the new volume has many characteristics of the original book that became a go-to book in Ukrainian historiography, both in North America but also in Ukraine. It is very well structured, it is well argued, it is very clear. and it provides something that Ukrainian historiography badly, or wherever it's Ukrainian, done in Ukraine or in North America, badly needs and often lacks, and this is synthesis. Synthesis based on the inclusion into the research work of the others, but also very much based on research with the primary sources of the author. So Zenon again gets to that level, that benchmark that was established by his earlier book. There are, however, significant also differences that reflect the new realities in which this book was written. And one of them, Zenon already talked about that is the emergence of Ukraine as the place not only of study, but of the place where the very interesting and groundbreaking research done on that important period in Ukrainian and European history. The second maybe major difference is that there are, you can see in this new volume, new trends that emerged in the study of early modern period globally. I certainly think about this book as contributing to the field of new intellectual history. And that is the very difficult genre of history to write when it comes to the early modern Ukraine with paucity of sources. But Zenon goes beyond the traditional works of political thought or historical thought that we have been dealing with for a long period of time, beyond chronicles, beyond the theological works, and looks at the place where normally people didn't look for the ideas and expressions of the political thought. And this are certainly the Hetman's universals and letters and correspondence, and puts that into the context of the political development of Ukraine. What we see in this book that we didn't see in the previous one, also the spatial turn. Zenon started his presentation with this wonderful Italian map from the last decades of the 17th century, which has a reference to two Ukraines, one of them being free Ukraine. So Zenon's study of this, the spatial imaginations of the Cossack elite, thinking about the borders of their state, thinking about the borders of their fatherland, they're extremely important representations of this new trends that emerge in historiography, and now we can see them in this book. There is also a new look at the themes that were studied before, and this is Cossack certainly chronicles and Cossack historiography, the ideas of nation building, patriotism, something that Zenon Kohut just talked about. In terms of the frame of the research, chronological frame of the research represented in this book, as I already mentioned, it makes perfect sense to me looking at Zenon's contribution as a whole to the study of the period. He does and deals with the period of history that was not covered by his earlier book. I would say that the most interesting and innovative for me is not so much the ending of the story with the constitution of Poland, but starting it around the Union of Lublin, because that is not the period where any history of the Cossackdom written under with whatever questions, academic questions being asked, none of those histories start with the Union of Lublin. On the other hand, it is extremely important to think about the Cossack political thought as in many ways a continuation and variation on the thinking that has been established by the Ukrainian nobility, that became such an important part of Ukrainian history and Cossack history after the Khmelnytsky uprising, and certainly very much influenced thinking of this second half of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century. Apart from the noble influences, Zenon looks at, of course, the works of the church hierarchs and ecclesiastical works, and at the works of the Cossacks themselves. So looking at these three different threads, one coming from the nobility, another coming from the intellectual tradition of the Orthodox Church, intellectual tradition of the Kievan Metropolitanate, and then the new tradition that the Cossacks started to create really even before the Khmelnytsky uprising, but certainly after it. The traditional view of relation between the ecclesiastical and the Cossack political thought was that they were going on the parallel course. And in that sense, we are, till certainly appearance of this book, very much were prisoners of this significance that have been given to Constitution of Polyporlik on the academic level, but also on the political level and cultural level. By introducing the concept of Mazepian synthesis, really, Zenon, first of all, allows to our understand of how relationship between the Cossack and clerical thought and culture have been developing, not only separately, but also how they were in connection with each other, how they influenced each other. So you look at the synopsis in which some ideas represented in synopsis are compared to the terms and the ideas expressed in Hetman Samoilovich's pronouncements and also in his letters and universals help to make this point very, very clearly. So again, I think that rethinking the relationship between the clerical and Cossack writing, political writing, history writing, and two cultures is maybe one of the most important contributions of this book. I certainly was convinced finishing this volume that Zenon achieved his main goal, or at least one of his main goals, presenting the Cossack political thinking and political culture as an important stage in the development of Ukrainian self-identification. Exactly as Zenon just said, not just a reservoir of ideas, but also as a stage and foundation on which the new generation of the Ukrainian activists and writers and thinkers now of the 19th century built and developed their ideas of modern Ukraine. I will stop here with congratulating Zenon Kohut once again with a major achievement.
Thank you very much. I also would like to remind participants that they may add questions on the question and answer section. We now have the honor of hearing from a writer of a synthesis of Muscovite Russian history of a similar period, Professor Nancy Shields-Coleman.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. Zenon, congratulations. This is just a quite wonderful book. And as he said, it's just it's valuable because it's such a wonderful synthesis of intellectual history that we have known in general, but to put it all together like this in one grand sweep is valuable and intellectually exciting. I want to point out that in this book, from the 16th century into the 18th century, Zenon sweeps tracks not just the Cossack grand narrative, but the Ruthenian grand narrative, and shows how the two of them intertwined with each other. It's a real tour de force of dozens of a close analysis of dozens of primary sources, and it shows off the richness of Ukrainian intellectual culture in the early modern centuries. So my task here is to comment on the book from the perspective of a Russian historian. So I want to make 2 points. One is about intellectual community, and one is about what he calls Ukrainian political thought's fraught relationship with Russia. So first of all, intellectual community. As a historian of Russia in these centuries, I knew that Russia lacked the institutions of intellectual community of its neighbor, the Polish-Lithuanian state, including Ukraine. But it's really impressive to see how rich that actual Ukrainian intellectual community was. By intellectual community, I mean the existence of physical spaces and a critical mass of educated people who can create ideas and share them. And such spaces include schools, printing presses, monastic scriptoria, the courts of princes and nobles and hetmans, voluntary societies like fraternities, etc. Intellectual community of this sort, of course, requires widespread literacy and printing. And in Kiev, Lviv, Cossack courts, noble estates, they all constituted places with dense intellectual communities in early modern Ukraine. Let's look at Kiev. The Caves Monastery had a sophisticated scriptorium. Its monks produced the synopsis. The Kiev Brotherhood School turned into the Kiev McGill Academy that produced dozens of publications and educators. Other printing presses produced scholarly works, often illustrated with Baroque engraving. Cossack court hosted writers and artists, and private homes from noble estates in the 16th century to the coteries who produced the Historia Rusov in the early 19th century. They were also intellectual communities. From the 16th century onward, Ukrainian intellectual life had a rich variety of ideas and an interchange, as Zenon shows in this book. Meanwhile, Russia had none of this, neither places nor people to populate an intellectual community, and that only began in the late 17th century in Muscovite, and of course, with Ukrainian foundations and very few native Russians. Clerics educated at the Mohila came to Moscow. They established a Greek, Latin, Slavonic school where they tried to inculcate the classical curriculum of the Mohila Academy. Scholars like Simeon Politsky and Epifany Slavonetsky led the way. In the next generation, it was the polymath, Theophan Prokopovich, bringing new genres and new ideas to Peter the Great's course. So foreign experts were bringing to Russia technological and military change, and no native Russians, however, seemed very interested in writing political theory. It took a few generations for Peter's Europeanized and newly literate nobility even to begin to think about writing political thought. And even then, they understood that criticizing autocracy was out of the question. And of course, printing presses were not available to them either. They were under state and church control in 18th century Russia, except for a brief decade in the 1780s. So a few modest odes and sermons and plays were written that you might call political thought in Russia. They almost unanimously praise autocracy. And even when in the early 19th century, the Russian autocrat commissioned the writing of histories of Russia, they, Karamzin, I'm thinking, based their grand narrative, as Zenon shows, to some extent on a Ukrainian work, the synopsis that was first written in Kiev in the 1670s. So meanwhile, Ukrainian writers had been writing chronicles, essays, constitutions, and other genres of political thought for 3 centuries. So as a Russian historian reading Zenon's book, I was impressed not only with how rich Ukrainian intellectual life was and diverse, as Serhiy was pointing out, but also how crucial Ukrainian intellectual life was to creating even the limited intellectual community that Russia developed through the 17th and 18th centuries. I would have one question for Zenon. I'd like him to say more than he did in the book about the dissemination of the works he studies. I would probably support the idea that these ideas are significant even if they weren't circulated broadly. They might constitute a step forward or a new angle on political thought. But it's most relevant to know how well these writings were disseminated. So if Zenon had time to tell us more about publication data, manuscript data, popularity over time, were there any works that didn't circulate broadly but you still consider important? That's issue of dissemination is always really interesting in intellectual history. So a second contrast to Russian history, I'm struck at how gingerly these authors dealt with Russia after 1654. Zenon calls it a fraught problem. Before then, Ukrainians were working out what he calls the Ruthenian grand narrative, which modeled the Ukrainian sense of self on Polish rights and liberties. It envisioned a Narod led by the nobility, but including Cossacks and burghers, and it found its legitimacy in its origins in the Kiev Rusian state and Volodymyr's Christianization. But in 1654, as he shows, the Cossacks negotiated the Pereyaslav Agreement as a military alliance with Muscovy, presenting the Hetmanate as a self-governing polity whose rights and privileges they expected that the Tsar would respect. And this treaty established the precedent in the Cossack grand narrative, which was keeping the Muscovites at arm's length. Now, taking a different tack towards Russia, however, of course, was our Commandant Gisel's synopsis of the 1670s. As we've heard, It asserted a complete ethnic and historical continuity from Kiev in times to Muscovite and eliding any sense of Ukrainian identity. No wonder that it provided the basis for what Hrushevsky called Russia's traditional scheme of history in Russian 19th century history writing, and that traditional scheme exists today in Putin's Russia. Zenon is particularly effective on the synopsis, I think. I think he cuts it down to size by showing how it was a self-serving, desperate appeal by the monks of the caves monastery to maintain their autonomy. He also demonstrates, I think, in the course of the book, that it was a great exception in Ukrainian political thought about Russia. Cossack thought uniformly defined the Ukrainian experience as distinct, politically, historically, culturally from Russia, even in the Mazepan synthesis. He's particularly effective, it seems to me, on the Bendery Constitution and how it designed an entirely different historical origin in order to assert a non-authoritarian, non-Mazepist, and non-Russian vision of Ukrainian political and national identity. And I also particularly appreciated Zenon's epilogue, where he shows the great dependence of Russian nationalist thinking on Ukrainian models, like the synopsis, and he shows how both the Ruthenian and Cossack grand narratives contributed to the thinking of Ukrainian nobles, Ukrainian families of noble and Cossack heritage as they worked out this little Russian vision of Ukraine's relationship to Russia. So in conclusion, I would say that a fitting tribute to Zenon's work, and I think I've said this to Serhiy before, a fitting tribute to his work would be for the Canadian Institute or the Harvard Institute to consider publishing some translations into English of some of these crucial texts so that we can use them in our teaching. It's no easy task to do a scholarly, properly annotated translation, but who knows, maybe Frank or Zenon have already done rough versions of some of these sources in translation for their teaching over the years. It would be great to have the Istoria Rusov or Eyewitness Chronicle, at least in extensive excerpts. All I know so far is that valuable collection edited by Lindheim and Lutsky called Towards an Intellectual History of Ukraine. But in the meantime, Zenon's detailed and thoughtfully analyzed studies of so many works of Ukrainian political thought are a great substitute. Thank you and congratulations, Zenon.
Thank you very much. In our divisions, I have taken upon myself to discuss the contribution that this book might be seen as making to Polish historiography, and particularly to Polish historians. And I think the choice of dates of the Union of Lublin, relatively, we can argue about the importance of that exact date for our history and whether it should go a little earlier or a little later as to where the real roots lie. But basically from that 16th century, I think brings up the issue of the inheritance of the Polish crown and of the Commonwealth that is formed and how that affects Ukrainian history, as I said, in the area that was covered by Hrushevsky. Now, part of my discussion comes from newer discussions that email and enthusiastic colleagues in Ukraine who, despite missiles and bombs and a lack of electricity, still continue in carrying on. And above all, with Natalia Starchenko, who I'm very grateful for bringing me so much new information on the role of the Ruthenian and Ukrainian lands and their population within the context of the Polish and Lithuanian states and then the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I have jocularly said to her that she suffers from schlachtomania and Rzeczpospolitophilia. She is much too polite to say that my problems are Kosakomania and Hetmanatophilia. But I think she wouldn't mind me attributing them to her. I think it has been handed to me now as part of the Ukraine Global History Project to write about Cossacks, when I much would have thought that perhaps nobles would have come to me. They have come to Natalia. But many of these have been discussions which Zenon and I have had for a long period of time. And usually because I was more deeply rooted in things Polish, and he, of course, because of his original work on the Imperial Russian narrative. And I think it's been a fruitful interchange. But as I deal with Natalia, I continue to believe that Ukrainian historiography developed as two different silos, one in Ukraine and one in what might be called the West and Ukrainian diaspora. That is, if despite the fact that Hrushevsky was banned, at least a populist vision of Ukrainian history or some concept of the less elite classes as being the important element of history, albeit at times Cossacks being, as in 1972, unacceptable for Soviet Ukrainian Russified historiography. If that was the dominant narrative and one that affects Ukraine to this day, those of us who worked in the West rather worked under professors much affected by Lipinski, by the statist school, by the vision that, above all, nobilities were extremely important in the Ukrainian past, even to the point I remember at one point, Pritsak, I thought exaggerating by writing that the Union of Hadyach was one of the great events of world history. I would not have put it quite that high on the list, although I mark that it was significant. And as I recently wrote to Natalia, I think if her question has been, what is the role that Ruthenians played within the Commonwealth and how did this affect them and Ukrainians? My questions have tended to be what caused the failure of the Commonwealth in the Dnieper Basin, and how did Cossack Ukraine develop out of what had existed on those territories before? I think that's above all a question, my question, as her question is important for Polish historians, but they are important for different reasons. She is reintegrating a knowledge of Rus within the Commonwealth, but also able to show the development of Ruthenian identity. I think that's something that Teresa Kinchevska-Henel pointed to long ago and is an extremely important topic, as well as trying to restore a narrative that has been somewhat negative towards Cossacks, towards nobles, above all in the case of Hrushevsky, and replacing both the princes and the nobles to that past. Whereas I think what I have long tried to do is to suggest to my Polish colleagues that really history does not end in 1648 or on the 1772 borders. That is, the projecting backwards of the Commonwealth, but leaving out the territories that secede or the territories where the Great Revolt succeeds, somewhat weakens our understanding of the Commonwealth itself. That is, one must understand the Hetmanate, I would argue, in order to fully understand the Commonwealth. I admit this reverses the historical order, but I think heuristically is really very useful for understanding. And as well, with all respect to those traditions which are maintained from the Commonwealth, it in the end did fail or was unable to root itself in the Dnieper Basin. And that is what I think Zenon's book brings back. That is, it takes us back to the 16th century, to that world, but does not have the teleological traditional endings. And those endings were largely with 1648 as some major breaking point for both Ukrainian history and Polish history, and encourages us instead to look at continuities from those periods. And so it gives us a new periodization. Above all, it takes us to that period, which, as Zenon points out, which might be argued as in sequence with Russian and Petrine history for the early 18th century, but for an entirely different reason. It takes us to the world of the Khazars. I think it is extremely important because the book as well brings up the issue of Sarmatism. I think one of the most written about and most poorly written about elements of Polish history. That is, we to this day do not really have an inclusive study trying to define Sarmatism, show all its sources, and show the degree to which it operated either as a thought or a ideological system. A recent work by Tomasz Gruszecki, I think, is very convincing in showing that perhaps Sarmatia was only a geographic concept and never really argued for joint ethnicities, or joint social status in its origins, and has pointed to Tadeusz Mankowski as perhaps putting us in the wrong direction. Because if one does accept that, all the more interesting is the Khazarian myth, which Zenon brings up. That is, if too easily we have accepted it as, I think, just an answer to the Sarmatian myth, but what if that Sarmatian myth didn't quite exist that way? Perhaps we need a Roxolanian myth, and then to explain the Khazarian one. And of course, many Ukrainian historians are working on these topics. Zenon as well, in his book, causes us to challenge what might be called the golden age of Polish historiography or historiography of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The wonderful work done from the 1950s to the 1970s and early 80s in Polska Ludowa, in People's Poland, in which a whole generation of Polish scholars tried to show that the vulgar Marxism was not the way for historical learning, but in so doing, may it be seen as into an element defensive of what the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was. We all can think of Tasbir's book, State Without Stakes, but we also have to deal with what for Ukraine was an important aspect, that is the decline of both tolerance and toleration in the 17th century. And here I think Zenon's book can play a major role. Very good Polish historians have pointed out that they have been able to finish all of their studies without ever hearing that the Hetmanate existed. That is recently, I think, been improved by a new generation of Polish historians who do look at this, but it is not yet combined into a synthesis. And so this book on Cossack Ukraine, which will show its roots within the Crown of Poland and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, also in a way can show us towards looking at new understandings of the social, political, cultural, and identity structures of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth by seeing it through the perspective of the development of Cossack Ukraine. And that way neatly put what I call two silos to break them down in Ukrainian historiography, but including Polish colleagues as well. So I'm very grateful to Zenon for undertaking this amazing work of synthesis that breaks down territorial, state, cultural, and national borders, and yet on the other hand, addresses all of these issues as well. So thank you once again, and the Jacyk Center is particularly thankful. We are fortunate that Zenon has agreed, and we'll see if this is possible to answer a few questions if they are posed. But first, I will give him an opportunity if he would like to say something to us now and also discuss the commentaries.
All right. So first, I am very pleased, even overjoyed that I was able to complete this book. As I noted in, I think, my introduction, this book was done entirely during a period of illness. Sometimes I was away from continuing its research and writing for 5 or 6 months even. And that's one of the reasons why it took well over a decade to write. And it is a great joy that it will now finally appear in print. I also would like to express my thanks. Thanks to a lot of people who were always encouraging me to continue working on this. I already mentioned, well, we have the panelists today. Well, was discussing this, all various aspects of this with Frank, I would say, if not on a daily basis, but at least on a weekly basis by phone. And that gave me a great impulse to continue. I also was working with Serhiv Plukhi or was examining certain questions, specific questions of Cossack history. I am extremely also grateful to Larissa Bilaus, who actually was bringing me materials to the hospital bed so I could still continue in a very limited capacity, but still continue on this project. So this is the main thing I would like to express. My gratitude to all those people that were encouraging me, and without whom I could never completed this work. Now, I would be willing to answer a few questions, more specific questions that people would like to ask.
I have a question from Andrei Doronin, who would like to know when did the Cossacks themselves begin to understand that that they were not one of the peoples inhabiting Malaya Rossiya, but an organic part of a Malorossian or Ukrainian people?
You know, that's a difficult question to answer. I know it's definitely because it changes. I would say in the earlier part, they do believe they are a portion of the Ruthenian people or nation. But as you would know, as in the early constitution and so on, they now opt for another thing, that this also has to do with estates and with class interests. They are, then the concept comes out that there is a separate Cossack nation that is linked with Ruthenia and the Ruthenian nation, but it is separate and is a well, I mean, being a Cossack is a nation by itself, and that there is that there are Ruthenian people who they are part of, but also a Ukrainian nation in which they are exclusively part of this nation.
Okay, and maybe I would just add to this, of course, one of our problems of sources for the Cossacks, that is so much in the 16th and up to the early 17th century, is what others say about them. The speculation, and some of us, both Nancy and Serhiy and I, as well as Zenon, have dealt with it. And then, of course, when the others say about them are the Kievan clergy and give them quite a grand lineage. And then finally we get their documents, and I would argue by the end of the 1620s, where we can argue wherever their origin may have been, those who lead the Zaporozhian hosts become part of it. Okay, our next question from an anonymous questioner says, to what degree is your book arguing that it was the Ukrainians or groups from Ukraine who were giving a justification that Muscovy had a, in quotes, Russian inheritance.
You have the whole tradition of the Ukrainian clergy, in which they were actually building a concept of a Slavonic church. So it was less on any kind of ethnic or other basis, but on religious basis. That they were trying to build a unified orthodoxy. And within that framework comes the idea of a also then unified state. That is Muscovy, or the Muscovite Tsar, really, not Muscovite thing. And so it's there is gradually a split between the clerical concepts and a secular Cossack concept. I don't know whether I've answered that or not.
Yeah, I think in general answering on it. And what I think also could be suggested as to how much these intermixed. Many of us were back at Harvard, and Zenon as well, when Ned Keenan was propagating his vision of two different cultures
Yes.
going on in Muscovy. And I think it leaves for us a big question of how does this work in Ukraine in the Hetmanate? To what degree really there were two cultures or there were intermixed cultures, both socially, and wonder if you would say a few words on that.
Well, I would opt for the intermixed cultures, but there were two identifiable cultures, and that they sort of were intermixed and were in many ways, in some ways, complementary, and in other ways not, depending on the emphasis.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, and of course I had in mind you have people like who Roman Rakushka or people like Hunashevsky who go from Cossack officers to clergy back and forth, and they're studying together at similar institutions. Now, I think there are a number of questions that you will have online, which we will send to you. Wait, let me just try. I will read one more, which is from Václav Zheng. Thank you for the wonderful book and presentation. Given that Frank discussed how Ukrainian intellectual history could reshape our understanding of the Polish historiography, I would like to approach the issue from the opposite side. To what extent was early modern Ukrainian political thought influenced by contemporary 16th century, 17th, 18th century Polish thinkers, and if any, Lithuanian, German, or Italian thinkers? And with that, I think we would conclude with that broad question, would conclude our questions for you.
Right. I think that Polish cultural traditions had obvious impact on the development of Ukrainian political culture. But on the same, at the same time, I would say that they, the Cossack thing, while based on various ideas of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and of the culture of the nobles, also did a unique sort of synthesis in which they, the Cossacks, the Cossack culture, established a different, a unique Ukrainian political culture that was influenced very much by Polish examples, but also had its own sort of well, let's see, I'm not expressing this. Its own entity.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think, yes, with that. And for those interested in this, we assure you the book will be out next year. We look forward to having presentations of the book. And we are all, I am grateful to Larissa Bilaus, who worked so well on the Cossack project and helped us organize this event, to Serhi and Nancy for their comments on it, to Natalia for the support that CIUS has given for this project. I also thanked our donors that made it possible to carry on this work on Cossack Ukraine. Many might think at these very difficult times for Ukraine and the battle that goes on over current disinformation and events, that these are, after all, rather arcane and obscure periods. I think what we have all learned is how important they are and how much importance comes from getting them right. We are all grateful, and those who read Zenon's book will see it, about the wonderful research that was done in Ukraine in these 30-some years of independence, when finally these topics could be turned to. And we look again, just as his book on Russian centralization and the Hetmanate engendered a whole generation of historians in Ukraine, we hope this new book will also serve as a stimulus for research on an international level. So I thank you all for taking a part, and we all look forward to the appearance of the book. Thank you.
And I thank everyone for attending, and just my general thanks.